Many of us know Psalm 23. If we learned it by heart, we perhaps learned it in the old King James Version. Maybe that's what comes to mind when you hear those words. And so we're going to read that in a moment. And as we read it, perhaps Psalm 23 takes you back to a memorial service of someone you love and miss a lot. Or maybe you have read or prayed this psalm during a difficult time in your life. And you think about that time when you hear it. But this morning, I want us to consider that this is not a psalm that's just for funerals or for times of crisis, but can help us think about our relationship with God in our everyday lives. So I invite you to read along with me from Psalm 23. And if you still had your hymnal open, it's on page 137, just before where we just sang. And I invite you to read these words all together with me, or if you know it by heart in this version, to say it with me. But let us read together Psalm 23. And again, that's page 137 if you wanted to read it from the hymnal, if you don't have your King James Bible with you. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemy. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Amen. As you hear those words this morning, I wonder what God is saying to you through them. What phrases or themes stand out to you this morning there? When I think about God making me lie down in green pastures, leading me beside still waters, restoring my soul, I think about the last couple years. How in 2019, God laid on my heart to ask for 2 months of a time away for a short sabbatical spiritual renewal time that I was asking to take in January and February of 2020. And I made that request, not knowing, of course, what laid ahead. At that time, I didn't even know that I was going to be coming to be the pastor at Blackburns Chapel in July of 2020. And of course, I had no idea that COVID was going to hit soon after that. But once I already had in motion that time of asking for the spiritual renewal leave, I found out that my job was about to shift. Not only would I be serving as pastor of community engagement there at Boone Methodist, but also I would get to come out here and shepherd this flock here. And then, of course, right after JB and I spent 10 weeks away, we came back, and about a week later, the whole world shut down. And everything, still is a little different than it was pre-2020. So when I think about those 2 months away, I see how God was using that time to make me lie down and rest, to have a period of time where I wasn't so busy, wasn't rushing around doing lots of things, and how God was leading me to a place of stillness, restoring me through that time so that I could be prepared to walk in the paths ahead. In many ways, it was spiritually a time of preparation for what was to come, the stress of navigating a pandemic, the transition in my pastoral roles, and then eventually later that year, JB and I having to leave our home in Bradford and move out here to Todd. Yet such restoration and rest isn't meant only to happen in big chunks of time away like that, right? We can't always take that extended vacation or renewal leave. So as we think about Psalm 23 this morning, I think one of the things it invites us to ask is, how do we allow ourselves to be led to rest, to nourishment, to stillness in the midst of the everyday? Do we set aside time each day to be still, be shepherded by God? Of course, that can take lots of different forms. We might immediately think of having a quiet time of prayer and devotion, and that is a good way to be still and to be fed by God. But it might also take the form of a meditative walk or a hike or a run. It might be an intentional time of listening to God as we're listening to hymns or spiritual songs, or it might be listening to God through our conversations with one another. Intentionality is I think, one of those big things that helps us settle our spirits and let ourselves rest and be tended by God, having those intentional times where we're allowing ourselves to do that. But ideally, we can take some of that time each day, but also at least one day of rest each week, where our primary focus is not just our to-do list, what we have to get done and accomplish, but allowing ourselves to do what we need in order to be restored, to rest, to spend time with God, to spend time delighting in God's creation and in nature and with one another. That is one of the things that is God's ultimate purpose for us, to have that time each week, a regular rhythm in our lives. When God led the Hebrew people out of slavery in Egypt, the first thing he taught them in the wilderness was that they needed a day of Sabbath rest. I think this is one of the things that Psalm 23 invites us to as well. Too often, though, in our busy world, our busy lives, we aren't very good sheep. We are led to new pastures, but we don't take time to eat. We rush past the still waters. We refuse to stop and lay down. We wander off. We want to forge our own paths instead of taking the one the shepherd is trying to lead us down. And that is why I appreciate, maybe most in this psalm, the way that this psalm ends. In a few minutes, after we explore this psalm a little bit, we're going to sing a song. You hopefully got the words to it when you came in. It's not in our hymnal, but the words highlight that last verse of Psalm 23, where it says, surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life. But that translation, it doesn't really fully capture the full sense of that phrase. Some translations have tried to help us get a broader sense of it by saying, goodness and faithful love will pursue me all the days of my life. And that gets a little bit closer, because it's not just that goodness and mercy are following along behind us, but they're actually pursuing us. God is pursuing, chasing after us with goodness and mercy. I wonder what God pursuing you with faithful love and goodness looks like for you right now. What does it mean for God to chase you down to show you good things? When I look back over many of the best things in my life, think of maybe the time when JB and I first met and began our relationship, or the time when I came to Boone and began my work at Boone Methodist, or me coming here to Todd and becoming pastor here and getting to be involved with all the things going on in this community. Often those good and beautiful things that I see as gifts of God's mercy and righteousness and goodness, those came after some sort of dark valley times. God was with me through those difficult moments. Perhaps you've experienced that too. But even as I was going through those, God's love, God's mercy, God's goodness was chasing after me and had something good in store. often before I even realized it. And it would take a little while to look back and see, oh, that's where I was going all this time. There were green pastures ahead, still waters that would refresh and restore me. And it's interesting that while most of the time in the Psalms, when we hear about something or someone pursuing the psalm writer, it's enemies. How many Psalms are there where enemies are pursuing and God and the psalm writer is crying out, God, intervene because these enemies are pursuing me all day long. Yet here in Psalm 23, it's the opposite. God's goodness and God's love are what are chasing after the psalmist. They are the threat, that which is unrelentingly chasing after us. But that is God's nature, right? With us in every situation, good or bad, but always seeking our good, even through whatever messes or difficult things we find ourselves in. Turning even the worst things into something that can bring redemption, be redeemed. It's like the old song goes, perhaps you remember the Gaither song we sing around Easter a lot. All I had to offer him was brokenness and strife, but he made something beautiful of my life. This is who God is. As we think about Psalm 23, perhaps it's helpful to zoom out a little bit and think not just what does it mean that God is a shepherd leading us through these green valleys and beside still waters, but what does it mean that God identifies as our shepherd? We talked about this a little bit during the season of Lent as we saw that Psalm 23 is often paired with Jesus's saying in the Gospel of John, I am the good shepherd. The timing of Jesus using that phrase in the Gospel of John was thought to be during a celebration of the temple, a time of Jesus's community remembering God's presence on earth as they believed it was physically there in the Holy of Holies there in the temple in Jerusalem. And maybe Jesus saying, I am the good shepherd at that time brings people's minds back to Psalm 23 and so many other images of God as the shepherd throughout the Hebrew scriptures. In that particular context, maybe Jesus is reminding the people that God is not just right there in the temple, in the pristine places, the religious spaces, among the learned and the people who know all the right things to say about God, know all the right things to do, but that God is a shepherd. Often that imagery of shepherds was used to describe kings supposed to tend and take care of their flock, their kingdom. So that's one layer of meaning we see here. But if we think of the other times that Jesus uses this imagery, this metaphor of being a shepherd, maybe you remember that Jesus says God is the shepherd who goes after the one lost sheep, leaves behind, if he has to, the 99 who are doing what they're supposed to and chases after that one. We might also think about the shepherd as the one who is found out in the wilderness, among the chaos, among the untamed places of this world. In Jesus's life as good shepherd, he showed us in human form what is true of God, that God is not afraid of mess, not afraid to be involved with situations that might tarnish his reputation, not afraid to get their hands dirty, touch the untouchables, stay with those who no one else wanted to be around, heal those who others had abandoned. Jesus, as our shepherd, invites us to follow him in that regard. But unlike the picture we too often see of Jesus in clean white robes, holding that clean, fuzzy little lamb on his shoulders, Jesus, the actual Jesus, is more like a real life shepherd. I imagine dirt under his fingernails, sweaty and smelling like sheep, not just there for the photo op, but day in and day out, living among those in his care. We think about this image of shepherds. We might also remember what we see at Christmas, We know that at the time of Jesus's birth, shepherds were considered unclean, unworthy, often not allowed in the temple. Yet they are the ones the angels go to first, right? To tell the news of Jesus's birth. So what does it mean that this is the occupation that God uses, that Jesus later uses as a metaphor for who God is? That God is not afraid to identify with shepherds. What does it mean for how we see ourselves and those around us? What does it mean to trust this God absolutely with every part of our lives? That the God who goes after those who stray, the God who is not afraid to get involved with us, is the one who identifies with the lowly, the unclean, those often considered not good enough to be by those who are around them. This is our God who comes to pursue us with goodness and love, and who calls us to do likewise. Can we trust that this God, this unashamed shepherd, is relentlessly pursuing us with mercy and love? I pray that we can. Because in doing so, we can find our souls restored, ourselves abiding in God's presence. We can know and we can see that faithful, steadfast love with us and chasing after us, that we can share that love with others.